Hello, and thank you all for joining us here at the United Nations today as we mark the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. We know that the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans involved unprecedented mass human trafficking, degrading economic transactions, and unspeakable human rights violations. But focusing on the people who were affected reveals its true brutality. Because behind the facts and figures are millions of human stories, the stories of those who were ripped from their homelands and their families, the stories of those who fought against their oppressors, the stories of those who triumphed against all odds to win their freedom. Those stories continue today as people across the globe keep struggling together against one of the transatlantic slave trade's most harmful legacies, racism. This year's theme for the United Nations Outreach Program on the Transatlantic Slave Trade and Slavery is Stories of Courage, Resistance to Slavery, and Unity Against Racism. You will hear about the theme's elements today from senior United Nations officials, national leaders, ambassadors, and eminent personalities. But you will also learn about another legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, the spread of Africa's rich culture. The largest forced migration in history lasted 4 centuries. And as millions of Africans were trafficked to the Americas, they also brought skills, knowledge, and traditions with them. The powerful impact of that cultural transfer lives on and will be celebrated throughout today's program. It is now my pleasure to welcome the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed.
Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, the transatlantic slave trade ended centuries ago, and yet we are still grappling with the consequences. Its legacy of racism and the marginalization of people of African descent continue to haunt us today, which is why the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade is not just about the past. It is as much about the present. It is about confronting the contemporary resonance of the prejudice that slavery wove into our institutions. It is about striving for a future in which people of all races enjoy equal opportunity, dignity, and justice. Today is a day of learning, reflection, and action. It is not enough to simply enumerate the enormous numbers of Africans who were torn from their families and communities and forced across the ocean. Behind these horrendous statistics are millions of human stories. Enslaved African women paid a particularly heavy price. Treated as property, they faced sexual violence, forced childbearing, and saw their children taken from them for profit. Declarations are not enough to erase the horrors of 4 centuries of cruelty. We must actively reverse the consequences of generations of exploitation, exclusion, and discrimination, including their obvious social and economic dimensions, through reparatory justice frameworks. And we must build a public consciousness that cherishes values such as human dignity, equality, and respect for human rights. That starts with our education systems. The Secretary General will convene a summit this September aimed at mobilizing political commitment to transform education. Central to this is reflection around how our education systems must change to nurture an ethic of inclusion, equality, and sustainability within our societies. The transatlantic slave trade is an example of what happens when we stop seeing our common humanity. It is an era that must never be repeated. This year, we commemorated for the first time the International Day of People of African Descent to pay tribute to the contributions of people of African descent around the world and their struggles to combat all forms of racism and racial discrimination. The creation of the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, the promotion of an international coalition against systemic racism and for reparations, led by the Vice President of Costa Rica, reaffirms the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and can offer a unique space of exchange and recognition against prejudice and exclusion. As we gather today to honor our ancestors and to pay tribute to their rhythms of resistance, let us unite as one human family to fight racism, promote kindness, and advance equality.
To be a Calypsonian, you must know the rules. Just as if you're starting to go to school. Some learn it good and some learn it bad. But none of them is able to sing like God.
El calipso a mí me identifica. Me identifica por el hecho de dónde viene, de dónde partió el calipso, de dónde empezó. Es una herencia ancestral, musical, que considero que se debe preservar. El calipso viene de nuestros antepasados leanos, ¿verdad? Bueno, la historia nos cuenta que los negros hemos venido de África, hemos radicado en las diferentes islas caribeñas, ¿verdad? Y las costas caribeñas también, ¿verdad? Y llega el calipso a nuestro país. Yo creo que con la venida de la inmigración de los jamaiquinos, ¿verdad? Que llegaron acá a trabajar en las plantaciones bananeras y en el ferrocarril, y ellos trajeron su cultura para acá, ¿verdad? Que fue el calipso. Tuvimos la gran dicha de unos 100 metros de donde ensayábamos vive don Walter Ferguson. Don Walter Ferguson es el padre del calipso.
Cuando hablamos del calipso, estamos hablando de mi historia. El calipso es la historia de un pueblo que vino creciendo. Entonces, muchas veces cuando uno quiere saber de su historia, lo único que tiene que hacer es sentarse a escuchar música. En nuestro caso, el calipso.
I love my sweet Calypso. It is a rhythm from Port Limon. The people love it, they always dance it. They jump and prance with ice Calypso.
Para mí el calipso era la voz de un pueblo que hablaba. Era una protesta, era como alzar la voz de lo que estaba pasando realmente. Y la historia que fue pasando de boca en boca, ¿verdad? Y se ha mantenido también en mucha forma por el calipso. Así que ese arraigo lo tenemos y estamos tratando de pasarlo a la otra generación. ¿Y cómo lo hacemos? Involucrándolos. Y para mí es un honor poder legar. ¿Y cómo hacemos eso? Usted me preguntaría. Es vivirlo.
Mi abuela representa la raíz de mi vida. Desde muy niña crecí en un hogar netamente afro, con cuyas costumbres, cuya lengua se vino arrastrando a lo largo de nuestros años. Cuando me hablan de mi historia, lo primero que se me viene a la cabeza es resiliencia, fuerza, claro, esas cosas que se vieron trayendo desde el tema de la esclavitud. Soy orgullosamente perteneciente de un pueblo que durante muchos años tuvo que luchar por su libertad a pesar de haber nacido libres. Entonces son creencias, más que creencias, amores que llevo por dentro, mi orgullo lo cargo sobre mis hombros. esa resiliencia, el trabajo duro que nos ha tocado pasar son cosas que hoy en día voy a seguir arrastrando y a lo largo de mi vida voy a seguir arrastrando.
Desde nuestra existencia hemos tenido que estar en una lucha permanente. Número 1, la esclavitud. Número 2, la discriminación, ¿verdad? Y en ciertos países, los afro o los negros han sido minoría tanto en la educación, en las oportunidades. Entonces debe ser una lucha constante.
Claro, el racismo todavía está. La falta de acceso, las desigualdades, todo eso está y van a seguir persistiendo. Entonces, muchas veces para nosotros poder obtener lo que necesitamos, hay que alzar la voz. Y es muy necesario que las personas afrodescendientes lo hagan, pues es la forma en la que podemos lograr nuestra libertad.
Las mujeres hemos tenido más dificultades, menos oportunidades de trabajo muchas veces, no porque no querían, sino que no tuvieron la oportunidad.
Exactamente, Cahuita necesita más oportunidades, ¿verdad? Y oportunidades para todos.
Es que antes de hablar de afrodescendientes, hablamos de seres humanos, porque todos somos seres humanos y lo que tratamos de hacer con esto es que no haya división por el color de mi piel, sino que todos somos hijos de un Dios.
Soy felizmente una joven afrocostarricense y saber que llevo mi país en mi corazón, en mi mente y en mi lucha. Y decir que soy afrocostarricense me llena de orgullo. Yo celebro estas fechas con amor, con gritos, con cantos, porque es un día que me representa, es un día que representa a mi pueblo, es un día que representa mi lucha y mi libertad.
A mí me emociona escribir de nuestra historia más atrás, ¿verdad? Y siento que la unión es parte de cualquier ser humano que quiere avanzar hacia lo positivo, ¿verdad? Entonces cuando yo pongo en la letra my people, black people, we have to unite because it's the only way we can win the fight. ¿Verdad? My people, black people, get back to our roots. We have to unite because it's the only way we can win the fight. Entonces, cuando se habla de unite, de unirnos, es por luchar por nuestros derechos en un buen sentido de la palabra. No vamos a hacer guerra, no vamos a pelear. Y siempre con cosas positivas, con ritmos alegres, porque sentimos que la música alegra el alma. Y siempre hay que hacerlo con la mejor manera. Sentimos que el Calypso está con su efervescencia y necesitamos ese empujón para mantenerlo con vida y así vamos a tener viva la memoria de nuestros antepasados.
Singing you, my people, black people, tell me, get back to our roots, our roots. We have to unite, because it's the only way we can win the fight. We're losing our language, we're losing our food, we're losing our culture, we're turning back like stiff-necked fools. Singing you, my people, black people, tell me, get back to our roots, our roots. because it's the only way we can win the fight.
Today, we remember, we recall the victims of enslavement and the transatlantic trade that lasted over 400 years and remains one of the most inhumane, traumatic, and shameful chapters of human history. We pay tribute to our ancestors who survived the forced voyage of the Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean, only to be met with more violence and terrible conditions on land. As descendants of Africans, people of African descent across the globe continue to experience the lasting legacy of this horrendous experience. Racism permeates our societies and is experienced in our daily lives. It manifests itself in blatant human rights violations and in structural inequalities, including lack of access to justice, to education, and health. It is seen in the unequal distribution of resources and in the disproportionate impact of crises and disasters. As we honor the enduring legacy of our ancestors, let us recognize the incredible strength of people of African descent, which carries through our stories, is woven throughout our music, art, customs, and other expressions of identity that unites us as a people. As Marcus Mosiah Garvey said, a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. As we unite to eradicate the global scourge of racism and racial discrimination, let us keep our history, traditions, and culture alive. Let us remember the resilience of our people who never gave up and who continue to prevail and indeed to thrive. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade provides a solemn moment to pay tribute to the memory of the almost 13 million Africans violently deported from their homelands to suffer the dehumanization of slavery. It also embodies our duty to remember the millions who were tragically lost. What makes the transatlantic slave trade unique is its entrenchment in the idea of racial hierarchy according to which certain races are inherently inferior and therefore deprived of any dignity. This ideological underpinning, along with internationalization, made it more pervasive over time and space than any other system before or after. And this dehumanizing ideology lives on today in the racism and discrimination that prevails in contemporary societies. It's not gone, it's still there. And this year's theme, Stories of Courage, Resistance to Slavery, and Unity Against Racism, makes the connection between the past and the present, putting the spotlight on the legacies of racism and discrimination. Legacies that sadly prevail in our societies, leading to persisting inequalities and marginalization. Indeed, slavery is based on the premise that some humans are expendable. And this humanizing ideology lives on the racist and discriminatory activities and views that our societies still hold. Hence, today's commemoration is a reminder that fundamental freedoms and rights, hard-won through resistance and solidarity, must be translated into economic, social, and political equality, and full and equal participation in our societies. The ongoing pandemic has served as a magnifying glass, revealing the intrinsic connection between those legacies and the vulnerabilities of people of African descent. We know that they have been disproportionately exposed to COVID-19 due to their living conditions, marked by deprivation and abject poverty, and also due to their higher employment rates in frontline occupations, their presence also in informalities, or the fact that they have really very, very packed housing. As long as racism and discrimination continues to play a structural role in our societies, we will continue to live in the shadow of the transatlantic slave trade. This is the spirit of the International Decade for People of African Descent that spanned from 2015 to 2024, proclaimed by the UN General Assembly. It is also the goal of UNESCO's programs. Through our Slave Root project, we support memory initiatives, produce innovative knowledge in the history of slavery, and we deepen our understanding of the ideological foundations of racism. We are promoting an empowering African perspective on the African history through our General History of Africa. It's the story written by Africans. And with more than 500 members around the world, our International Coalition of Inclusive and Sustainable Cities, ICAR, provides a platform for cities to share best practices and combat racism and discrimination. Our action against hate speech mobilizes all of our fields of competence to eliminate negative prejudices and stereotypes. And UNESCO's Global Call Against Racism and Discrimination, that our members adopted in 2020 and they made us super proud, has created a further impetus for scaling up these activities to change mindsets and behaviors through laws, regulations, practices, and changing mindsets. And as a result, we have developed the Anti-Racism Roadmap for more strengthened and impactful action. And catalyzing all these efforts, UNESCO is organizing every year an annual global forum against racism and discrimination. This is the place to be for this crucial dialogue. And I want to thank the government of Mexico who are hosting the next Global Forum Against Racism and Discrimination in November 2022, after Korea hosted the first one in Paris in 2021. Legendary African American scholar and activist Angela Davis said, "In a racist societies, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist." Let us draw this inspiration from the courage of women and men who resisted slavery to join hands and become agents and change against racism.
Papa, nous allons pas étonner. Moi manque noyé dans la gona, garçon solide moi. Manque noyé à go. Moi manke noye nan bassin sa, garçon solide moi. Garçon solide, oui, mon si m'bake noye nan bassin sa, gande m'dape noye.
Rhythms of Resistance, the theme that gathers us here on this International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, have unquestionably shaped the societies throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. The roots of these rhythms are firmly planted in some 4 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. Imagine the horror of people snatched from Africa, forcibly removed from their homeland and families by strange aggressors and from places unknown, trudged to unfamiliar waiting ships, hearing the waves wash the shores of Africa behind them, savagely crowded onto the waiting ships, then hearing the waves of the ocean crashing against those ships. They would have surmised that they were leaving Africa behind them, but to go where, they did not know. Neither could they imagine the horrific chattel slavery in the Americas and the Caribbean into which they were sailing. The slave trade and slavery in due time provoked a sense of moral outrage, not just among the enslaved, but also among those who believe in human rights and fundamental freedoms and the dignity of humankind, irrespective of race, color, or origin. There was, however, and still is, something enslaved Africans brought with them, something passed to them from their ancestors, carried in their hearts, in their voices, in musical instruments, and above all, in their determination to survive, rhythms of resistance, performed by the enslaved in music, song, and dance. The rhythms truthfully tell stories of the rich and multifaceted history of Africa, its people, its diaspora. They tell the stories of the cruelty and tragedy of slavery. The rhythms tell much more. Stories of empowerment, of unique song and dance traditions that have made a stellar contribution to music and the arts, in the first instance, in the Americas and the Caribbean, and in the second, worldwide. Slavery has been abolished, but racism and racial discrimination, the abhorrent legacy it left behind, today continues unabated, encircling men, women, and children in the African diaspora in treacherous ways. But the rhythms respond to the challenges of racism and racial discrimination. They empower. They uphold the power of resistance. They provoke self-emancipation. They say clearly that humanity cannot be taken away and that a people cannot be erased from history, that racism and racist agendas shall continue to be resisted and shall never prevail. Importantly, the rhythms accentuate the words of the 2022 theme for the United Nations Outreach Program on the Transatlantic Slave Trade and Slavery: stories of courage, resistance to slavery, and unity against racism. These rhythms, influencing the Americas, the Caribbean, and the world in song, music, and dance, not only keep in focus the vibrant cultures of Africa through its diaspora, the rhythms inspire and encourage unity among humanity, build determination to stand against racism and racial discrimination, to create and seize opportunities for reconciliation and accord among races, and work tirelessly to let freedom ring, and in so doing, to let it sing, let it dance, let it play, let it resist, and let it serve to help free our world from the terrible scourge of racism and racial discrimination. I thank you.
Yes, this is Rocky Daouni live and direct from Ghana. And as we really focus on the transatlantic slavery and its impact, and bringing various voices from the motherland and the diaspora and international organizations, to really try and find a way towards the future, I feel my offering today is a song about focusing on the people, their souls that were part of this whole thing. So this song is called Beautiful People, to put that energy of beauty in the story and the outcome, ultimately the future.
I dedicate this song to you, my beautiful people. Oh, beautiful people, come and sing along, yeah. Here I come as a song, oh, beautiful people. My beautiful people, come and sing along, yeah. But there are many things we cannot hide. There are many bonds that can be undone. Just like our bond, yeah. Everything in life is a sacrifice, but I know it was worth the price, for I did it for you. I dedicate this song to you, my beautiful people. My beautiful people, come and sing along, yeah. Here I come as a song, oh beautiful people. My beautiful people, come and sing along, yeah. Whoa, 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 yet I did it for you. Oh, I dedicate this song to you, my beautiful people. My beautiful people, come and sing along, yeah. Here I come with the love of beautiful people. My beautiful people.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, once again we gather to commemorate the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. The theme for this year, Stories of Courage, Resistance to Slavery, and Unity Against Racism, is a reminder of the fearlessness, heroism of the men, women, and children, innocent victims, who experienced the brutal acts of human beings against their fellow human beings in one of the greatest tragedies in the history of humanity. This year's theme is even more pertinent as it relates to the reality that people of African descent continue to face discrimination every day. Nonetheless, they continue to rise up to the challenges they confront in their daily lives and their very existence. The African Union has consistently reaffirmed its rejection of the continuing discriminatory practices against people of African descent. Additionally, last year, at the high-level meeting of the General Assembly, to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action on the theme Reparations, Racial Justice, and Equality for People of African Descent, member states of the African and Caribbean regions called for the respect, promotion, and protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms for all, as well as the implementation of international obligations and commitments relating to human rights in accordance with international human rights law to prevent manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Today, I would like to reiterate that call and urge us all to recommit to promote the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms of people of African descent in particular, as we acknowledge the tragedy of slavery. The events of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade may be far away and in the distant past for some, but the duty to remember is for all of us. Today, we honor the memory of the victims and remember their legacy. We celebrate their heritage and acknowledge their contribution to the development of different communities and nations worldwide. And in the spirit of this year's theme, Resistance to Slavery and Unity Against Racism, I call upon us to unite against racism and discrimination in all its forms and honor those who, through their struggles and triumphs, victories and pain, brought changes and revolutionized the society. As global citizens, we must continue to champion for equality and equity and break down the barriers of hate and build a world where all human lives are valued. I thank you.
Hello, my name is Dominic McKenzie, Assistant Professor of Communication Media at the historically Black university, Oakwood University in Huntsville, Alabama, in the United States. I'm also an adjunct faculty member in journalism at the Northern Caribbean University, located in Mandeville, Jamaica. As a journalist interested in stories about the Caribbean and the African diaspora in the US, my storytelling often includes an exploration of racial justice and or injustice in our communities. And this year's commemoration of the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade is aptly themed Stories of Courage, Resistance to Slavery and Unity Against Racism. Now, for over 400 years, more than 15 million men, women, children were the victims of the tragic slave trade, which I'm sure we can all agree is one of the darkest chapters in human history. For that reason, I am excited to engage with a very special guest today to learn more about how these stories have impacted his work. Allow me to introduce you today to Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, the 8th Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Now, why is Professor Beckles the best person to talk with today about this topic? Sir Beckles was selected by the heads of government of the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM, in 2013 to be the inaugural chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which coordinates the Caribbean government's policy positions on the global reparatory justice conversation and globally promotes reparations for Native genocide, African enslavement, and colonialization. Professor Beckles, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Dominic. The pleasure is mine. It's a tremendous honor.
So let's start here. You know, we've heard many definitions, whether academic or otherwise. What do you think people need to know today about the transatlantic slave trade? You know, we've learned quite a bit about it, whether in school or in passing. But what should we know that you believe we may not be aware of today?
Well, I think as the Black world continues to to struggle for equality and to engage all cultures, all nations about this global equality and the search for the dignity of Black people and to confront the institutional racist structures that militate against their inability to contribute to humanity in the way their God-given talents have allowed them. To understand that struggle, you need to know what you're fighting against. But the source of the problem is clearly the transatlantic slave trade, the societies that were built upon slavery, the way in which slavery was used to generate wealth for the white global supremacy structure, and now what we are up against in terms of the legacy of that history.
And I'm really glad you said that because, you know, I have in my notes here, in order to know where we're going, we must remember where we're coming from. That is something that I hold true in my own life. And as a Jamaican raised in Jamaica, you know, we heard a lot about the transatlantic slave trade in lessons in school, from, you know, preparatory school all the way to college. A partial quote from the executive director of the UNFPA, Dr. Natalia Canham, last year during the commemoration of this event said, "Together we remember the past and act in the present." Now, what are some lessons from that time that you personally have held on to from the experiences of the enslaved? Do you think we can still apply to our lives today?
Well, I have not been able to make a distinction in that mechanical way between past and present. I have not been able to do that. I see nothing around me in my own life to suggest that can be done. I was born and raised in Barbados, which was the first major society built on slavery in our hemisphere. This was the colony where African people were the majority for the first time, and this is the place that had the first slave code in which Black people were defined as property, and that model was exported to Jamaica and South Carolina and globalized. From there, as a teenager, I was transported with my family looking for work, migrant workers, to England. So therefore, I moved from the colony of white supremacy to the metropole where the white supremacy was able to manifest itself in wealth and power. And along that journey, I always knew that there was something wrong. There was something not quite right. You know, what I was learning at school, what I was observing in the streets, who the streets were named after, who owned the land, who owned the buildings, why we were poor and why other people were not. That entire reality of living from childhood to present was illustrating to me that there's no such thing as the history. This is the reality. And the reality is a place where the past and the present, you know, co-join. For example, here on the campus, the University of the West Indies, where I work, this campus was built on a slave plantation that produced sugarcane. And all around the campus are the evidence of that structure called slavery. A few years ago, we were constructing a medical faculty, and the bulldozers came to lay the foundation for the building. And as the bulldozers were clearing the soil, what came up from the ground? Thousands of bones. Bones just came up from the earth. And when we did the detailed research, we realized that we were constructing the medical faculty on the burial ground of the Africans who worked on this plantation. And there we go. You know, the bones came up from the ground. Our ancestors were talking to us. We were going to build a medical faculty, and we were going to do that on a cemetery. But we didn't realize that these Africans who worked here, they were worked to death, and their bodies were thrown into shallow graves, and dirt was thrown upon them, and that was the end of that. But the history doesn't work like that. It comes back. So as a metaphor, the history forces its way into your present, and it says to you, look around, be sensitive, Open your eyes, open your ears. You are surrounded by history. And that really is how it's done. So my entire life as a historian, as a playwright, and as a sportsman, and all of the other identities I've developed, I've had to live with this history around me, speaking to me every single day. It shapes who I am, it shapes my identity. And each time I think of the struggle for justice, I see the obstacles in front of me that have to be overcome.
You know, I thank you for sharing that. I'm curious if you're able to take us back to the first moment when you realized something wasn't quite right here. Can you do that for us?
You know, when I was 6 and 7 years old, and my grandfather, who worked on a sugar estate, and I had to carry his lunch for him out into the cane field. And I would walk into the cane field, and I would see a white boy, a teenager, on a horse whose parents owned that estate. And here was a teenage white boy on a horse driving dozens of black men into the cane cutting operation. And he was like a power from hell, you know, on a horse, and these black men. And I knew even then, at the age of 6 and 7, that there was something wrong with this. This is not right. Why is this little white boy on a horse, you know, supervising dozens of grown men, black men? And even before I knew that there was something called history, I knew that there was something wrong with this. And I wanted to know, where did this come from? What's the explanation for this kind of display of power and racism?
You know, I think for viewers and myself included, listening to these stories, you have to kind of feel something in your spirit when you hear that, right? How do you cope, or how have you coped with reading the dozens of stories of people who were alive during that time, the things you've seen in your own lifetime? How do you cope while navigating this kind of, you know, this conversation, this continued conversation?
In my own case, I had an impulse to research. Rather than, you know, get emotionally melt down by it, I rushed into the libraries to read about it. And I read a great deal in my community library. I did a lot of research about what is this all about, how and why. So my response was A, to gather the knowledge, B, to participate in organizations to confront that legacy. So I became a teenage organizer. I was a grassroots organizer as a teenager because that was my reaction, to gather the knowledge and be an advocate about the resistance. But at the same time, I can tell you, it was very, very painful. I remember on one occasion, I was probably around the age of 18. I went to an archive in Birmingham City to look at the records of the slave trade companies, the companies that bought and sold Africans across the Atlantic. And I was reading the captain's logs, the logs that spoke about how many Africans were taken on board, how many Africans were shipped across the Atlantic, how many survived, what was the sale price in the Caribbean, what was the return on the investment on the sale, and the high mortality. And I think the case I was looking at, there was like 35% mortality on that shipment. And all the information is set out there in a balance sheet, you know, the profit and loss balance sheet of a modern company. And I remember sitting there in the archive and crying like a child. And the tears were streaming. I was traumatized by this. It took me, I would say, about 2 or 3 years to overcome the emotional trauma in order to settle down and to become an effective researcher and historian.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's important for us to understand that we all have a part to play in this. And listening to those stories, we can identify some things we can apply to our own lives. I want to ask you, several concrete actions would have been taken over the last few years to address racial injustice that would have found its roots in the trade. In your estimation, what are we missing? What actions have not been taken yet, do you think, would bring us whether an inch or dramatically closer to a society free of this kind of injustice?
We are just scratching the surface. We haven't told the story yet. We are just collecting the fragments of the story. We are just describing superficially the structure of slavery and the evil of it. I want you to imagine the human horror. Now, what I did was to study 4 estates. And I looked at the average age at which Black girls had their first child. And I took these plantations from the 18th century. And on these plantations, 95% of the Black girls had their first child when they were 12 to 13 years old. Now, so that's only one aspect of it. And in 88% of those cases, that first child was a mixed race child. Now, you have therefore to imagine this plantation reality in which white men were taking little girls, not yet teenagers, barely able to show their maturity, and they had first sexual access and brutalization of those children. That story has not been told. Nobody has researched that as yet the way we should.
So then for the 13-year-old, Black boy at home right now watching this conversation, the teenage young woman watching this conversation, what role can those people now play in the fight for racial justice? Those folks at home who are really considering, I'm not an academic of any sort. How can I have any impact here? What would you say to them?
But it is all about values and this thing called resilience. It is phenomenal that we were able to survive this. So what we have to say to our young brothers and sisters, always understand that you are the offspring of survivors. You are the descendants of survivors, and therefore you have to keep before you that spirit of survival, who you are, what's in your blood, what's in your DNA. Don't ever give up. No matter the adversity, don't ever give up. Understand that what happened to you was an injustice. You therefore have to have consciousness to fight for justice. But you don't fight for justice by being angry. You fight for justice by being intellectual, by being strategic, by being a thinker, by being an advocate, carrying other people's along with you. But you must not end up in a jail, or you mustn't end up in a psychiatric hospital. You have to use your intellect the best you can. Don't let it break you, but let it be the basis of your strength. So there are some important stories and messages to impart to the younger generation how that past and history around you can make you into a fine human being.
Professor Beckles, I feel your passion, and I'm sure the folks at home do also. You said earlier, to understand the struggle, you must know what we're fighting against. And I think it's an excellent way to leave this conversation. My gratitude to you, sir, for spending this time just breaking down what's most important in this conversation for everyone, all of us, to join that fight for racial justice wherever we are in the world. Professor Beckles, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dominic. It's been a pleasure.
Hay un país en el mundo lleno de colores, sazones y ritmos. En sus calles hay millones de rostros e historias no contadas. Historias que hablan del esfuerzo, del dolor, de las alegrías y del orgullo de su gente. Historias diferentes y lejanas, pero a la vez similares y cercanas. Hay un país en el mundo donde todas las historias comienzan con un buen café por la mañana, donde cada día la gente se levanta y da lo mejor de sí.
Je m'appelle Aline Ndiaye, alias Webster. Je suis un artiste hip-hop et un passionné d'histoire.
Je vous ramène dans le temps pour quelques instants, vous dévoiler des faits qu'on n'apprend pas forcément. J'entretiens une autre histoire, celle qu'on voit pas dans les cours. Amérindiens et les Noirs, celle qu'il faut remettre à jour.
Je suis né puis j'ai grandi à Québec, d'un père sénégalais qui est arrivé en 1970, est venu étudier ici. Il a rencontré ma mère qui est de Québec aussi, du quartier Limoilou. Dans ma jeunesse, dans les années 90, déjà j'étais très intéressé par l'histoire afro-états-unienne. Donc on va parler de Martin Luther King, on va parler de Malcolm X, on va parler de Rosa Parks, sans comprendre ni savoir qu'il y avait une histoire afro-québécoise et afro-canadienne. C'est une histoire avec laquelle je suis entré en contact beaucoup plus tard. Et tout au long de mon parcours, j'ai toujours étudié l'histoire du Québec d'un point de vue extérieur. Je voyais comme leur histoire. C'est-à-dire que je ne voyais pas mon expérience, je ne la voyais pas traduite dans les médias, je ne la voyais pas traduite dans la musique qui se faisait, dans les films, dans les émissions de télé. Mais c'est à travers le rap que je voyais cette réalité en tant qu'afro-américain, dans le sens continental du terme, je la voyais retraduite. Et donc, c'est comme ça que le rap m'a permis de contribuer, d'amener ma brique à l'édifice culturel ici et de m'approprier cette culture-là. Et donc, c'est quand je me suis rendu compte qu'il y avait tout ce pan méconnu de l'histoire que je me suis penché sur ce récit-là. J'ai voulu le transmettre, j'ai voulu que les gens puissent entrer en contact avec cette histoire et comprendre que le Québec, le Canada s'inscrivent dans tout le reste de l'histoire du monde atlantique. Qu'il y a eu l'esclavage ici, un esclavage domestique, qu'il y a eu de la ségrégation ici, il y a eu du racisme ici. Et donc, pour moi, j'avais envie de voir comment est-ce que cette histoire s'articulait ici sur ce territoire. Notre manière de raconter l'histoire depuis le 19e siècle fait que l'esclavage a complètement été effacé de la trame narrative collective, notamment du fait qu'il n'y avait pas beaucoup d'esclaves ici, donc ça a été facile de le mettre en dessous du tapis, si on veut. Il a été facile de l'effacer des livres d'histoire. Mais toujours est-il qu'il y a eu de l'esclavage ici, sous le régime français et le régime britannique, dès 1629. Des gens à Québec, à Montréal, à Trois-Rivières, en Gaspésie, ont eu des esclaves autochtones, africains et afrodescendants. Et donc, j'avais envie de montrer qu'il y a une présence, qu'elle soit africaine ou afrodescendante, au Québec et au Canada depuis des siècles. Et c'est comme ça que j'ai monté cette visite guidée. Donc, j'explique vraiment la nature de l'esclavage ici et les différents détails de cette pratique, la forme que prenait l'esclavage, les lieux de l'esclavage ici. Il y a une présence noire ici depuis aussi longtemps que la présence européenne. Québec est fondé en 1608. 20 ans plus tard, il y a déjà une présence africaine ici. De 1629 à début 1800, on compte 4185 esclaves de répertoriés. Sur ce nombre-là, les 2 tiers étaient des esclaves autochtones et le tiers était noir. Et ce qui est particulier, c'est que partout où est-ce qu'on va au Québec, on va retrouver des noms de rues, des noms de municipalités, des noms de bâtiments, d'écoles qui sont nommés d'après des propriétaires d'esclaves. J'ai récemment donné une série de tours guidés à la direction du service de police de la Ville de Québec. Et donc, le fait de pouvoir se retrouver ensemble, échanger, je pense que c'était très positif d'un point de vue personnel et individuel. Je pense que pour cette institution-là, de comprendre l'afro-enracinement dans la Ville de Québec, ça va permettre de faire face, d'être mieux outillé pour faire face à certains enjeux. Et le blackface, les minstrel shows vont exister jusque dans la deuxième moitié du 20e siècle. Les gens faisaient du blackface pour des levées de fonds pour des écoles ou pour des églises. Et donc, et le blackface et les caricatures ont permis d'ancrer dans la population des stéréotypes et des manières de voir l'autre. Donc voilà, on va aller par là-bas. Pour moi, le racisme joue un rôle central dans notre compréhension de notre présent, joue un rôle central dans notre compréhension de bien des inégalités dans le monde aujourd'hui. Et donc, c'est pour ça qu'on doit comprendre l'histoire du racisme pour comprendre ce que nous sommes aujourd'hui et comprendre cette pluralité de notre identité de manière plus inclusive. Et ça permet de revoir la manière dont on conçoit la québécité et la canadienité.
Excellencies, esteemed guests, friends, thank you all for being with us today. The United Nations will never forget the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. We will continue to fight racial injustice, and we will promote and protect the rights of people of African descent. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Our program will now end with one final musical performance. We hope it inspires you to remember the history, address the legacies, and take action towards a more equitable world.